Continuing on, we're going to go through a couple of specific technologies, meaning IoT, blockchain, cybersecurity, and silicon. So when we talk about IoT, it means the Internet of Things, and that's what we're talking about, systems being connected and a variety of different devices, whether they're monitoring devices or sensors or whatever. And so by 2020, they predict that there's going to be 50 billion connected devices in the world. And so what drives IoT and why has that happened? Well, one is low-cost semiconductors that for a very small space, and not only that, semiconductors have gotten so good they don't consume a lot of power. That's made it possible. Also silicon sensors, that you can make small miniature sensors for under $1, and this includes cameras. The internet. Actually, I was working on IoT before there was an IoT, and there was no internet. And so the question is how do you integrate these billions and billions of data points together? Well, now we're talking about petabytes. So you need some kind of communication bus, meaning something has to request the data. How is the data going to be sent over? And so we were actually doing that, and now we have an internet. And then cloud computing. How do I analyze all this data? So it's all up there in the cloud. In terms of IoT, as you could see, a lot of companies are getting experience with it, that they're realizing that there's a lot of potential. And what do I use it for? I can use it for control or alerts. I can use it to collaborate with stakeholders. And also I can make my customer experience better through better data. So the impact is, will every company get into it? No, for the simple reason IoT requires you to understand hardware and software, and it's tough to be both a hardware and software company. However, if you look at the big five right now, and I'm talking about Apple, Microsoft, Google, and what we see is that those companies have got, Microsoft forced itself to get into hardware. They did, quite simply because they realized that if they were in software, they'd always be cut out through half the equation. And so it's complex because in terms of supply chain, these companies who've done software forever, all of a sudden now they're worried about things like trucks. In terms of security, that's a big concern about doing IoT. There was a hack of wind turbines and they started putting bad data in it. And so security is a very big issue. Big data management, the 5 V's, velocity, veracity, volume, variety, meaning data could be multiple things. Data could be images, data could be numbers, data could be words. And so, and I'm missing one of the V's. Well, you can look it up. But anyway, the big ones though are volume, velocity, and variety. Those are the three most important ones. And then veracity is how truthful is it, because we don't trust things in the internet. And in terms of processes, how much internal change is it going to take you? And then you have to become a data-driven organization instead of cultural and instincts. Blockchain. For those of you who aren't familiar with blockchain is, what blockchain is supposing I put data within a block and then I give it a name, a username, and this is what we call a hash. And my blocks can come from other sub-blocks, which are considered to be children, and they're authenticated from the top hash. There's no universal definition, but they all kind of say the same things. And the idea behind blockchain is that I have a ledger, something that records all the data of all the transactions of what happens. And it's shared by everyone, not by one specific party. And the way you can kind of think of it is, supposing I have a transaction with my bank, so I withdraw $100 from my bank. And then the question is who owns the ledger? Who owns the information about that transaction? Well, I don't own it, the bank owns it. What's to prevent the bank from cheating me? What's to prevent the bank from making $1,000 disappear out of my account? Now, on the other hand, if all 100,000 people, say we're using my particular branch of bank or whatever, got together and said, we're going to do it all amongst ourselves. But in order to change anything, you have to have a majority, meaning 51,000 people have to approve it at the same time. Not only that, there's 100,000 copies of that transaction to everybody in the chain. And that's the idea of blockchain, that when you do a transaction, different parties have different pieces of the information, whether you're a supplier, excuse me, I'm still fighting terminal cold, or someone else. And so now everybody has access to all the information. So it's a peer-to-peer network. The elements of blockchain are, the block itself is basically a stored data transaction. The block has info on who's participating, and not only that, but the hash is a digital signature. Your digital signature. The information about you, nobody will know about because you're just going to have a username. The hash creates a unique identifier. So the process is first you need a transaction to take place, like leaving something in your shopping cart is not a transaction. And then then once the transaction takes place, it gets verified. And so computers in the chain have to verify it. Bitcoin right now has 5.9 million users. So 51% need to get approval. The storage, the info is stored in one block, and a block is actually a megabit. So you can have a lot of information in there because, me buying $6 at Sonic is only kilobits worth of data. And so you're joining together hundreds and maybe thousands of blocks. And then once the block is verified, then it's given a hash. So it's about storing it, and not editing it. You can look at a blockchain. Go to blockchain.com, and you can actually see, the blocks that are being created. And anyone in the network can see the chain, and everybody has a copy. And you have your anonymity. But how do you trust it if you don't know who created the block? For example, what if a bunch of hackers or thieves from the dark web came together and created an entire block and then asked you to get in charge of it? Part of the security in blockchain is that hackers have a hard time getting by the hack. And the reason why is every time you add a block, information about the entire ledger is in there. So supposing my first block was A and my second block was A plus 1, well, I can erase A and change the information. But then blocks A plus 1 also have the original A's information, and so does A plus 2 and A plus 3, so you'd have to change all of them. And that's really difficult because to get past the hash, that's a huge computational problem. Now, what is Bitcoin? Well, Bitcoin is what we call a fiat currency. And yeah, Dr. Cho was stupid. He didn't get into Bitcoin. And yeah, I could have made a mint, but to be honest, I just didn't trust it. The thing about dollars and things like that, they're backed by governments. And the thing about governments are like, supposing the Chinese took my dollars and they ripped me off, and they were doing to all Americans. Well, this is why you have warships and things like that. I mean, people, will go to war over these things. I mean, we've gone to war over oil. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor because of oil. But what we mean by fiat currency, for those of you who don't come from an economics background, is like, for example, when they created a dollar, how do they correlate a dollar to how much you pay for a loaf of bread? And that's why they call it a fiat currency. How did they determine that gold would be this much? It's arbitrary. However, it has to be consistent between everything else. If I buy 2 loaves of bread, it should, unless there's some kind of marketing sale going on or something like that, it should still be equal double of what 1 loaf of bread is. And so that's what Bitcoin is that all the Bitcoin users got together and established how much it's actually worth. And so solving these problems, these hash problems, is referred to as proof of work. And there's 1 in 7 trillion chance you're going to get it right. Adding a block to the chain is referred to as mining. And so hackers don't necessarily, when hackers have tried to get into blockchain, they'll typically do it as kind of a phony front to get your money. But it's just too difficult to hack the blocks themselves. And so the wallet is the program that records all the transactions. You have every block has a private key and a public key. Your public key is basically where you're going to open and store the information. Your private key is the one that's basically the lock to it. Here's the negative of blockchain. If you lose your identification, you lose everything. There was a really funny scene in the program, Silicon Valley, where a guy took his blockchain information and he put it on a USB drive, and then he left it in a pair of torn jeans, and his maid threw the jeans out because she thought they were just garbage. And here he is, like in a landfill, going through the entire thing trying to find his jeans, because that Bitcoin was worth 100 million, or cryptocurrency I should say, is worth $100 million. The thing is, if you have competing chains and you're not quite sure which one to believe, the consensus is always going to pick the longer chain because you have more people verifying it. And we've already talked about the majority rules. In terms of speed of blockchain, a lot depends on what your perspective is. Like, for example, if I deposit a check in my bank, if I go over $10,000, it could take 2 or 3 days before they verify the transaction. Well, in blockchain, when you do this with Bitcoin, your verification is within minutes. Authentication is you're looking at the identification, labeling, that sort of stuff. It's considered to be unhackable, and because there's no central authority, it's considered to be tamper-proof and more reliable. However, all things in technology have a trade-off. Those trade-offs are implementation. You need special coding to do it. Subversion, again, those dark chain webs you have to work out. If your chain is too small, those are the ones they go after. In effect, they kind of treat blocks as kind of like a herd of antelope running. You go after the small, weak antelopes. You don't go after the big, long ones. Proof of work can take up to 10 minutes. And that's the problem. When you sit down and think about it, the bigger data computation you ask your computer to do, the more power it consumes. The power of that 5.9 million Bitcoin users every year is equal to the power used up in all of Denmark in a year. It's a power hog, and it makes sense. An example is your cell phone. If you notice, when you watch a video, your cell phone battery dies faster. And it's all because the more complex the computation, the more energy your computer is going to use. And blockchains are safe, but the reason why they're safe is because they're complicated. And so you pay for it. They use it in banking, cryptocurrency. They're looking at for healthcare in terms of safety and record keeping, government records, and also supply chain. In the next video, we'll start talking about applications.